Welcome to Rob Paints Models. Today we're going to be painting the Thorns of the Briar Queen. We're going to be starting at part 1 here with the Chainrasps. And, Varklav as well, and the Everhanged. All them Chainrasp guys. This is what we're doing in this video here. So let's start out by painting the robes. I'm going to be doing this with an airbrush. If you want to see a similar effect on how to do this with a paintbrush, you can check out my Chainrasp video that'll be popping up on the screen right now. I'm priming these guys black, and I'm going to be using an airbrush to paint some Mechanicus Standard Grey over, well, it's not all of it. The top part is black, so I'm using that Mechanicus Standard Grey to lightly zenithal highlight the top kind of cloth area. But from the bottom up, I'm painting a gradient, so you can see that I don't quite meet that top cloth area with that Mechanicus Standard Grey. And then take some Dawnstone and I paint the gradient again, not going quite as far up as the Mechanicus Standard Grey did. Our goal is to get to pure white at the bottom of our spooky ghost, and almost black just where it meets the dark cloth. You want to use some thin paints here. I'm using the GW Air paints, they're actually quite good. Need a little bit of thinning so that they don't go speckly, but they're pretty good out the pot. So I'm using Administratum Grey, going just, again, not quite as far up as before. Take your time with this. You want this gradient to be really smooth. Essentially we're painting just value at the moment, just light. And we'll tint it later. Next paint is Ulthuan Grey, just hitting up the bottom areas of the spooky wispy effect there. And now finally I'm using VMA white here. You could use GW's white air paint, but I had VMA white to hand. Doesn't matter which white you use for this. I'm just making sure that the very ends of those effects are pure white. Now I'm taking some Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm using the same air paint, but you could use the regular base paint version. My small dry brush here, and I am dry brushing all of the cloth to pick up the raised corners of the cloth, the folds, and the edges as well. And I'm also going to do this over the ghosty spooky effect that's beneath, just again to try and pick up all the folds and make those look raised. For the cloth, this is a highlight. For the spooky effect, this is essentially making it brighter. We're going to do the same with Dawnstone. Again, same colours that we used for creating the gradient. This is the last highlight I'm going to do on the cloth on the top of the Chainrasp, but I'm going to keep doing these across all of the spooky effect. The wispy effect. I call it the ghosty woo effect. So now Administratum Grey, just catching the very edges of that cloth there. And again, continuing it down into the ghosty woo effect. You can see how it's picking up the areas, especially on this guy's butt. Ulthuan Grey, only on the ghosty woo effect. Don't want to take this quite as far up the body, the ghosty woo effect, as you did the rest of the dry brush colours. But you just want to make sure that you're picking up all of those pronounced folds and edges. And finally we're going to take some titanium white. This is some artist's acrylic paint. This is my favourite white for doing this. It's very thick. You don't need to thin it down too much though for doing edge highlighting. And we're going to edge highlight all of the ghosty woo effect. Only the ghosty woo effect. We're not going to edge highlight the cloth with this. We're just going to go around all of the wispy ghosty woo effect and just create this, use this to give it a nice bright edge highlight. I'm not going to do this on the actual folds though, only around the edges, the very sharp corners that are available. Now I'm going to take some Gulliman Blue and Waywatcher Green in a 1-to-1 mix. I call this Mimiaran Green because Eldar, if you know, you know. Doesn't matter. We're putting this in our airbrush and we're spraying this again to create a gradient, and this is tinting our values that we painted before. This is actually giving us colour. Now this takes quite a few very thin layers to cover and give us the kind of colour that we want, a deep, nice, bright, saturated colour. Make sure that you let each layer dry before applying the next one. It will take 3 to 4 layers to build up a nice transition like this one. But cannot stress enough, must let each layer dry. Waywatcher Green is next, and we're just going to transition the Waywatcher Green from the very bottom where the white is up into our turquoise, Mamiar and blue, green colour. And this is going to create a beautiful green through blue to black transition that we want on these guys. You can vary the intensity of this however you want. Now we're going on to painting the skin. Now I'm going to paint him with a kind of purplish skin here. I'm going to start by base coating all of the fleshy areas with demonette hide. My rule on this was the arms are flesh, they're clearly flesh, they're definitely not bone. And if they have a face that's inside their hood, then that too is flesh. You know, one of the guys is carrying his head, saying that's bone. It was an arbitrary rule I made, but it worked out in the end. I'm now washing all of the skin with Druchii Violet. Make sure this doesn't pull too much on the tops of the arms. Use a clean wet brush to just clean that up. But you just want this to go into like between the fingers mostly and the recesses on the face. Now I'm going to be taking some demonette hide and some titanium white, and I'm going to be mixing an intermediate tone between the demonette hide and the titanium white. I'm just kind of eyeballing it here. I want it to be quite pale, and this is basically going to be used for touching up later. You could also use this for layering up the paints, because we're going to be doing this using loaded brush. And I'm using loaded brush because I found this to be a much faster way to paint the skin. But you can do this just layering it up from one colour into the other. To start at demonette hide, work your way up into titanium white at the brightest point, or a very light purple colour. But for loaded brush, get some very thin demonette hide into your brush, and a tiny dot of titanium white on the tip of your brush here. And what we're going to do is we're going to paint this with the titanium white is our highlight, so where we want our brightest point to be, and with a side to side kind of zigzag motion, you will see that the paint on the tip blends with the paint that's in the back of the brush. So we get our nice smooth transition from titanium white through a lighter purple through to our demonette hide base colour. Now this stays wet for quite a while. You can work it and adjust your blends, wet blending on the model. Now I found this, like I said, a lot faster than layering up or glazing, and I had 7 of these guys to do, so I had quite a lot to get through. And also this would be how I'd do it on a big unit of Chainrasps as well. You can see there, apply the white tip where you want your highlight to be, and then just use a side-to-side motion to blend in the colour that's on the back of the brush. Loaded brush is a lot easier than it looks. It sounds like it's a hard technique. All you need to do is practice. Practice on a few bases, just getting the consistency right. The most important thing is that the colour that is in the back of your brush needs to be very thin, but you don't want so much of it in your brush that it just goes and shoots straight off the brush onto the model. You just want just enough on the back of your brush to be able to keep it a little bit damp, and then you want your highlight colour to be much thicker than your base colour, which is why I use the Artist's Acrylic Titanium White, because it is very thick. It's thicker than Games Workshop base paints. It is the thickest white I have. It's also really smooth, highly pigmented. It works really well for loaded brush. So you can see here I'm just going around the entire arm, just using loaded brush, set out my base areas, and then going back with some wet blends and a little bit of my intermediate tone just to clean those up, get everything just the way I like it. I repeated this on the face as well in the other arm. The face was a little bit easier because it's a much smaller area. On the faces, you mostly just need to kind of dot some white around the eyes and on the teeth and around the nose, and then just keep the purple everywhere else. It's actually much easier to paint the faces than it is to paint the arms, because the arms are long cylinders that you want to get a smooth transition on. And we're mostly done with the Chainrasps. It's all details from this point onwards. I'm going to base coat all of the metallics with VMA Gun Grey. I find that if I use a bit of Flow Improver, I use Winsor & Newton Galleria Flow Improver mixed with water, 20:1 water to Flow Improver. Add this to metallic paints, it makes them flow really nicely and smooth. Takes 2 coats to cover with this, but it works so much nicer than just using a straight metallics or just thinning with water. So you can see here, just paint the chainmail, the sword, the chains, anything that's going to be a steel colour with the VMA Gun Grey to start. Now I'm going to use some Games Workshop Agrax Earthshade, and I'm going to very carefully wash this over all of my metallics. You may end up finding that a little bit goes over onto your ghosty woo effect. That's not the end of the world. You can touch it up with a little bit of your just basically repainting the ghosty woo effect in that very small area with a paintbrush. I had to do that a few times, but it does work out in the end. So just paint that Agrax Earthshade over all of it just to give it a nice kind of oily, dirty look. Now we're going to shade it with a Nuln Oil, the same deal here. The previous shade was to give it a little bit of colour, this shade is to give it a little bit of depth. Make sure you let the previous shade dry completely before doing this one. Now I'm going to take some Scrag Brown, and this is very thinned down, and I'm using a very sharp paintbrush, and I'm just kind of making little wiggly random lines over all of those metallic areas to create little patterns of rust. I don't want it to be too uniform, I'm not thinking about it, I'm just kind of jiggling my hand around and just letting the tip of the paintbrush paint really thin lines all over the metallic areas that I want this to. If there's any areas where, say, 2 metal parts like the handle of a weapon meets the actual blade or hilt of a weapon, I'll run some extra rust effects in there as well. Now I'm using VMA Steel, and I'm basically using this to highlight and kind of chip away the rust a little bit. So I'm taking this down all of the sharper edges of the blade. I'm just kind of doing it again in a relatively jiggly, random motion in order to make it look a bit chipped and a little bit worn. So I'm doing this all down the edges. I'm also going to be doing that on the flat of the blade with the very fine point at the tip of the brush, just to create a few more additional random patterns. You don't want to overdo this too much, otherwise it just looks like you've polished your weapon back up. On the chains, I actually did something very specific. I only highlighted the very topmost part of each chain link rather than all around the edges of it, because that way it looks like the light is reflecting off the tops of the chains, and it makes them look makes them have a lot more shape to them than doing it all the way around the chain itself. Now I'm going to base coat all of the gold or brass areas with Balthazar Gold. Again, I'm using some Flow Improver to make sure this flows a bit nicer and isn't too thick once it goes on, because Balthazar Gold is quite a thick paint with some very large pigment in it. So you want to make sure you use some Flow Improver to thin that down, and it will take a couple of coats to cover nicely, but once it does, it's actually a really, really nice colour. I'm going to be base coating the keys and the candle on Varklav here, and I don't think I used this on any of the other Chainrasps, just on Varklav. By this point, the other Chainrasps were basically done. Oh, I also paint the hilt of his weapon and the pommel as well, giving him a slightly more interesting sword, considering he's supposed to be the leader of the unit. Well, of the Chainrasps anyway. Now I'm using Liberator Gold, and I'm just using this to layer up on those gold and brass areas. It's not so much a highlight, I'm just kind of layering it up, leaving a little bit of that Balthazar Gold visible in the recesses. This was quite tricky to paint onto the candle specifically, because it's got a lot of very, very small details. I had to use a very light touch with my paintbrush in order to only pick out the details. It was also beneficial to not have any Flow Improver in that paint, because then it's a bit thicker and a bit more under control. Now I'm just applying some Agrax Earthshade into the very deepest recesses of those areas, mostly to give the keys some separation from each other, and to give the details on the candle hold just a little bit more depth to them. Just tidying up with some Balthazar gold there. Now I'm painting the candle with Mephiston red. I decided that all of my guys in my whole Nighthaunt's army, actually, well, not just this unit, we're going to have red as an accent colour. So for Varklav, he's got this nice little candle, which I decided to base colour red. He's the only Chainrasp that actually gets anything that's this colour on him. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time making that candle look really nice, because it's kind of a focal point of this model. I'm now using Mephiston red and titanium white again, and I'm going to be doing some more loaded brush. You could just, again, layer this up if you wanted to, but I found the loaded brush to be a bit faster. So just using the white at the very brightest end of the candle, I'm trying to create a kind of glowing effect from that flame. And I'm just using the loaded brush technique to just paint down a gradient towards the base. In this particular instance, it's a little bit too much, spending too long in the pale colour, and I'll go back and I'll paint some more red in afterwards once I've got the base of the transition down this way. I can just go back and do some glazes, fix that up, adjust the transition to my liking. Now, I did lose the footage for painting the candle flame, but it wasn't particularly good in the first place because it's such a small thing and I don't have a powerful enough zoom on my camera. But what I did was I painted the flame white, then I painted some flash gets yellow over that, then a little bit of brown, then a little bit of black, and then I just applied some Lamenter's yellow as little glaze around the top of the candle in order to make it look like it's got a glow lighting effect on it. And that's basically it. That's how I painted all of the Chainrasps for this warband. You can see here my patrons who helped make this video possible scrolling up. And part 2 will be covering the Briar Queen and the bases, so stay tuned for that. So if you liked this video, click the subscribe that's up there. There's a Patreon link down below as well. You can also check out this other video that YouTube thinks you'll like, and check out me on social media. Thanks for watching, hope you have a good day, and bye bye.